Welcome to the Daniel Bernardus podcast. If you find the content of these conversations interesting, please also have a look at my books. Freedom in Quarantine, about what it means to be human today, and Win Win Win, a novel approach to business and economics. I hope you enjoy the podcast.
Welcome everyone. This is the blog and channel of Daniel Bernardus. Today I'm going to have a conversation with Rolf Sattler, who wrote in his book Science and Beyond that the power of scientific explanations and understanding appears limited. Not recognizing this limitation leads to delusions about reality, a form of insanity. I thought this was a nice teaser to start off with, and I would like to introduce Rolf to you. Rolf Sattler is a professor emeritus of McGill University in Montreal, where he carried out research in plant morphology on the development and evolution of plant form. He published a lot of books, several books, more than 100 research papers, and award-winning ones. He received many awards and honors. And at McGill University, he taught courses in plant biology, general biology, the philosophy and history of biology, biology and the human condition. And he lectured widely around the world, including places like Harvard University, the University of California, Berlin, Zurich, Delhi, Malaya, and Singapore. So everywhere, just about everywhere. He was a speaker at many national, international conferences, and even spoke at the Dalai Lama 60th birthday celebration on life sciences and spirituality. So we're talking today about his book, Science and Beyond, Towards a Greater Sanity Through Science, Philosophy, Art, and Spirituality. We got in touch because I also have a blog called Science and Beyond, so there seems to be a lot of topical connection between the sort of things we're talking about, Rolf. Welcome to this conversation. Thanks a lot for joining me.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here and to talk about these topics that interest me a lot, as you know.
Yeah, it's well, we share this interest, and it's great also to talk about people that have like-minded worries and maybe approaches to things. I think a first thing we could start with talking about is that we're both scientists, we're even both biologists, so we have a lot in common. And well, your book, you're trying to emphasize the limits of science, but I think you're not trying to do that at the expense of science, because I think you are also very much a science lover. So what do you think, maybe as a first start off, what do you think is particularly attractive about science?
Well, I think science can lead to many insights. I've worked my whole life as a scientist, and I found out so much about well, I studied flowers, I studied plants, plant morphology. So it's fascinating to me what science can reveal. And it's just the problem is that it has also limitations, and most people, I would say, or many people, including many scientists, don't see the limitations. They think, they recognize, of course, that presently there are still many things we don't know, but they think that eventually science will tell us the truth, everything. And that's where I disagree, because I think there are profound limitations to science, and therefore we have to go also beyond science.
Yes, so you say not recognizing this limitation leads to delusions about reality, and it's even a form of insanity. So that is a pretty strong statement. Could you comment on that?
Well, to me, I define sanity, first of all, in very general terms, not just in terms of medicine and psychiatry, but to me, sanity means understanding and being in tune with reality. Right. So if we have basic misunderstandings there, then of course that leads to some form of insanity. And right. And that's what's happening. And this is very harmful to individual lives and to society, because I think it limits us much more than necessary. And so it impoverishes our individual lives and also society.
Okay, so you say it impoverishes, it makes our lives poorer in a way.
Yes.
You talk in your book, for example, about personal insight as something that kind of goes beyond the scientific. Could you comment on that? What you mean by that
Yeah, personal insight, which is subjective, right?
Yeah.
In contrast to objective, or means that it is not shared. I define objectivity as shared knowledge, shared observation. Like, for example, if we look at a tree, we all can agree, well, we are looking at a tree, right?
Yes.
But then we also have experiences, outer and also especially inner experiences that we do not share with other people.
Yes.
And these experience I call subjective. In my book, I give as an example seeing auras around, plants or people and so on. It seems there are not many people who can see that. And it took me a very long time to be able to see that. When I lectured, I still couldn't see it, but I referred to it, and students asked me, well, can you see it? And I had to admit, no, I can't. So they said, oh, so why do you talk about it? But then after retirement, when I had more time for meditation, eventually I could see most beautiful auras around leaves and trees and my hands and so on. And so that's a subjective experience. But because this experience is not shared with everybody, that doesn't mean that therefore is less real, right? Reality is not a matter of just a matter of being able to share it with something. In fact, what is shared is often more superficial than what is not shared. There are deep experiences people have, they don't share with other people, and they reveal very important insights. If we think, for example, of the great mystics, I mean, they had experiences that were not shared by the vast majority of people, but we cannot say that therefore they are less important, right?
Yeah. And so I think a typical someone within a scientific mindset would say, well, okay, I'm very happy that you can see auras, but how can you prove that to me? So how would you respond to such a question? Well,
I cannot prove it because, as I pointed, I have a whole chapter in my book about the inability to have proof in science and outside science, because it seems to me so obvious that proof, which means something final, is not attainable in our life. Because let's say we make an experiment or an observation today, and it seems to prove a hypothesis. How can we tell that if we repeat this observation and experiment tomorrow or next month or next year, that we will get the same result? We don't know the future, so we cannot tell whether we can confirm that. And therefore, it seems in science and also in outside science. So when people ask me, how can you prove it? I cannot say I can prove it. I can only say this is my experience, and of course my experience may be mistaken. I cannot say, you know, that I am God. I have the absolute. I can only say that's my deepest experience, and of course that's important to me, what I experience. That's important to me in science, very much so in science, but also in my personal life.
Yes. All right. So you say, well, it's important to me, but you also say that it's a road to approach reality, right? I get the impression, because that's what that's the wording you used earlier. So now let's look at it from the other side. So there are also people in academia nowadays who say, well, you know. Yes, we agree with you that also in science there cannot be absolute proofs. So that's actually why we should doubt very radically about the very possibility of our ability to approach reality and to approach truth. So why would you then say that can we still talk about truth in science, and can we also talk about truth in such subjective experiences? Because, well, it may be that you find something, I find something else. So if we cannot agree on it, why should we even start fighting over what is true and what is not?
Well, I think although we cannot have proof, we have evidence, and for some hypotheses or theory, we have much stronger evidence than for others. And so there is a big difference, I think. For example, for theory of evolution, or the idea that evolution occurred, there is a lot of evidence. Yeah. Or for that the Earth is round and not flat. There's a lot of evidence. So that makes a huge difference. But I would still say that although it's just evidence, and we don't know the future, so we don't know what other evidence, additional evidence we will get in the future, and therefore I think we have to remain open-minded. And I consider this one of the strengths of science, that it's open-ended. It's so one has to remain open-minded, and so we are not locked into something sort of temporary.
Right. Okay. So it's a process, but what I hear from your response, it is a process that's going somewhere, right? So there is a reality to be known, and science is a limited methodology, but a methodology that leads us somewhere. And at the same way, I hear you saying that our personal experiences are also a way to get to know at least some aspect of this reality, even though it may be difficult to completely communicate that always.
Yes. Oh, yes. And of course, words and language are limited. Yeah. This is also one of my major concerns. I mean, words and language are like a map, and a map cannot really completely reveal the territory of reality. So if you look at a map of Holland, let's say, I mean, it shows you a lot, and that's very useful, and that's an aspect of reality, I think. But there is so much that's not represented in a map. Therefore, a map is incomplete. And the same with language. There's so much that cannot be represented through language, and therefore everything that's represented through language remains incomplete. And therefore, I think when we use language in science and also in our personal lives, we are always somewhat remote from reality. Reality cannot be captured through language. This is often not recognized. If this is recognized, I think we would have much better communication.
Yeah. Thanks, Rolf, for that point. I'll add a little note from myself here, if you don't mind. I've been studying. Well, I'm trying to start on a philosophy PhD coming year on a Spanish philosopher that I got to know, but he's not very well known. He's called Leonardo Polo, and he for him, this point that you've just made is the core of his philosophical methodology. So he says that there's our mental, our concepts basically are the mental objects that we have in our minds. They, on the one hand, they really refer to reality, and that's important. But on the other hand, the reference is always limited. So there's always more to be known. And he says, well, his philosophical methodology is actually, recognizing that limit. So what you've just been describing, realizing that we have these limits helps us to then overcome them and go further towards reality. So I think it's that's very much synchronized, I think, with what you've just said.
Yes, in my book I referred much to Alfred Korzybski, who also emphasized that very much. His major work, his book that he published in the 30s, is entitled Science and Sanity. And he wrote a lot about sanity and also insanity in his book. And he emphasized also, again, that language is an abstraction from reality. Abstraction means a selection of certain features. So it cannot completely capture reality as it is. It can at best capture some aspects. And if this is understood, then this, I think, could also lead to much more tolerance, because different people, different scientists, different theories capture different aspects of it. And then instead of fighting each other, we could see this as complementary. And then having different theories, even contradictory theories, can complement each other and can be therefore much more comprehensive than just one. They can be enriching. But I think one problem in our culture, and also among many scientists, is that we think the theory that we have, that's the right one, and other people who have different theories, these are the wrong ones, and then the fight begins, and that's not very good and very useful.
It's neither productive nor very helpful. No, yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Very good. Yeah, that makes sense. I just one other thing to add on to what I said earlier is that I think what Polo also emphasizes is that it is, there are other ways of knowing than only your conceptual knowledge. So we have certain it's hard to put in words simply, but we have like a certain awarenesses, you could say. He calls that habitual knowledge. So, for example, we are kind of aware that reality exists, right? And this awareness is not a concept that we have, but rather it's something that kind of directly comes through us through experience. And if we are able to go beyond our concepts, we become more kind of aware of these awarenesses, you could say.
Yes.
And I think this is also relates probably to your experience in meditation, where you try to be kind of open to the reality around you directly, without being mediated by these concepts. Not saying that these concepts are not helpful, but you kind of need this grounding in reality before starting to kind of explore it conceptually. I don't know whether you would agree.
Oh, I totally agree. I think in general, spiritual and religious experience is a different way of knowing, because it's very personal and it's not conceptual, and it's also beyond language, right?
Yes.
So that's very important, and that's a very important point I make in my book, that therefore spirituality, religion is beyond science, and it will remain beyond science, because science will always be in terms of language and logic, a form of mathematics, a form of language, whereas personal experience, like in meditation, for example, or any kind of spiritual experiences, artistic experiences, they can go beyond language, and therefore, in that sense, they are beyond science.
Yeah. Well, here I have another quote from your book, which I think goes in this direction. Maybe you can comment. It says, therefore, spiritual traditions often emphasize more the heart and the gut than the mind, but the integration of the gut, the heart, and the mind seems most desirable. So I was wondering how you see that integration then.
Well, that's a difficult question.
Yes, that's what I'm here for.
The first thing I would say is our culture has, for a long, long time, since the Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, our culture has been very cerebral, has emphasized very, very much the brain and the mind. And science, of course, is very cerebral, also emphasizes very much the brain and the mind. And so there is a neglect of the heart and the gut. Yeah. And I think in subjective experience, we can, it can be more the heart heart experience and more a gut experiences. And these three kinds of experiences, then I would say, complement each other. And if they are seen as complementary, then of course we get a much broader view and experience of reality and the world. Now, you ask me, how do you integrate it? I don't know how to integrate it, but I think even if we cannot integrate it, recognizing that these three exist and that they complement each other and that they are necessary, to me is an enormous improvement. Also recognizing, for me personally, and I'm not the only one, I think that the gut is actually maybe the most fundamental one. And the heart is also fundamental. And you can see this in science. For example, when scientists fight about theories, they can become very hostile towards each other.
Yes.
And I think such fights are often not very rational. They are often guided by gut feelings. So even scientists, I mean, are not free of that. They may not recognize it. They claim it's all rational, but that's not my experience. I've observed so much during my scientific career, you know, how irrational scientists can get. And so I think the gut and the heart definitely play an enormous role. And that was also one of my aims in writing the book, to emphasize the importance of the gut and the heart. Because if we neglect that, then again, our lives become impoverished, restricted, and that's, of course, not very good for ourselves personally, and that's not very good for society.
No. Okay, so this is a topic actually I've been spending quite a bit of time thinking about, and I do have a few suggestions about this integration. I'd like to know what you think about them. So for me, first, well, I think there's several avenues. One is that it seems to me that science somehow needs a foundation. So you cannot really meaningfully do science without, for example, recognizing that there is such a thing as a reality to be explored. And I think, again, that this is something that comes to us more via the heart, you could say. So it's something that we, again, we have to kind of experience. But that experience gives us a basis which we can then start to rationally explore upon. So I think one way in which heart and mind interact is that the heart kind of helps us to set the stage, you could say, which the mind can then go on to explore. So that could be one possible integration. Another one, which has more to do with like the way creativity works. Well, I don't know what your experience is, but you know, I like to write books, and you've written a book. I'm sure you've written a lot of more than one book. You've written many books. You've written many papers. So you have experience also with the creative experience. What tends to happen to me is that when you think about a particular topic, so you try to dive into it, you try to think about it very carefully, and then you have this focus, right, on a particular aspect of what you're looking at when you're rationally studying something. But then when you need to write it down, you kind of need to take the step back. And the inspiration usually comes at a different time. So when you're either in bed or taking a walk or taking a shower, or and to me, that is also kind of a heart impulse, where kind of the heart helps to see the big picture, and then afterwards the mind can continue to kind of fill in the details in a way. So the two are similar, because the first one is more about the big picture of science as a whole, and the second is more of particular instances of creative work. But in that way, I think there's a real synergy.
Oh yes, and I see, of course, that there is an interaction between the gut and the heart and the brain and the mind, because we often have an intuition when we pursue a scientific problem, and this intuition may come through the gut or through the heart, but then we pursue it more mentally. So there is an interaction, and that is quite obvious. But when you talk about integration, to have a synthesis that really comprise the three, and how this will be expressed. We could not express it really through language, because language is too limited, right, to reach the depth of the heart and the gut. There, I don't know exactly how this integration, maybe it can manifest personally through personal experience, but not objectively through language, I think.
Maybe you could use a kind of a symbolic representation to get somewhere close or something, because symbols tend to be able to go a bit deeper, but still, of course, it's very incomplete.
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Let's go on to. I have another question. Well, this is something where I don't know whether I completely agree with you, but I get your point. So you also early in the conversation you said that well, we've become like a very cerebral culture. So I agree with that. I think it's a good point, and it's also, I agree with it, that's a danger. In the book, you specifically protest also against kind of Aristotelian logic, and then I think you mean especially to say like either or logic, right? So either this or that, and kind of to make a lot of separations, and you seem to prefer other types of logic that have more emphasis on both and to the two things. Now, so as far as this goes, I completely agree. So so I also think that that either or logic tends to be too exclusive, and we need to go towards more both and logics. The only thing I find somewhat surprising is that you also kind of put people like well, you kind of put the whole Aristotelian tradition under this either or logic, like people like Thomas Aquinas and so on. I've always read well, part of this tradition. So, for example, Thomas Aquinas, I've always read as very much a both and thinker, someone who tries to combine things that are hard to combine. But maybe you disagree. So I would like to know how you see that.
Well, Thomas Aquinas considered Aristotle the philosopher.
That's true, yeah.
Aristotle was very important and very fundamental to him. And I think this also included his logic. So in that sense, I think he also subscribed to either or logic. But the interesting thing about Thomas Aquinas is that I think at one point in his life, as far as I know, correct me if that's wrong, but I think at some point he had a mystical experience, and he went really beyond language and philosophy and all that. And he didn't want to write anymore at that point, because, as you know, mystics always have emphasized that their experience cannot be really expressed through language.
True.
So yes, Thomas Aquinas, I think, is in both, on one hand with Aristotle, but on the other hand went far beyond him. And this maybe is less known, but through his writings, I think he has perpetuated somehow Aristotelian logic. And I find Aristotelian logic also very much in religions, especially in religious doctrines, because there is so much disagreement and even intolerance between different religions, different religious doctrines, even within let's say Christianity, between different sects and so on. So this is a reflection, to my mind, very much of either or logic. There's some trend nowadays to go beyond that, to see beyond that. But I find traditionally, religions, especially religious doctrines, have been very much trapped also in either-or thinking, and of course our whole society. And this, I find, has been very damaging. It has led to a lot of conflict, even wars. So I think either-or logic has done so much damage, and it continues doing a lot of damage because so many people, including scientists, still think in terms of either-or. There are not many who have ascended to a level of quantum physics, where complementarity is well recognized. But for example, in my field, in biology, I encounter a lot of either-or thinking.
Yeah. No, I do see the problem. Okay, well, it's also not my field, so I find it's a difficult point for me because I haven't really studied the logic itself so much. But what I have studied the philosophy, and yeah, so I get the sense that you can kind of use or abuse Aristotelian logic. And
yes, excuse me, I did not want to say that either-or thinking is completely wrong and completely useless. There are situations where it makes a lot of sense.
Yes.
But the problem starts when we think it can be taken for granted and it can be used in all situations. And there are many situations where, to my mind, it doesn't make sense where it can be very harmful.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, Rolf. So I do think that that always thinking either-or is doesn't do justice to reality, basically, because there's a lot of times when we should recognize the unity of things, right?
Yes.
And not be so distinguishing. Yeah. Okay. Maybe we should park this discussion, but I get the impression that it's still possible also within Aristotelian logic to think both and, but not everybody does so, and that's a problem. So
yes.
Okay. Well, anyway.
That's the problem. Yes.
I have one other theme here, which is again a very big theme. So I don't know whether we will exhaust it, but I think it's very interesting. You say in your book, it is said that science can tell us what is, but not what ought to be. However, this distinction is not as clear-cut as is often assumed. The science of animal behavior has shown that true pillars of morality, such as sympathy and intentional altruism, can be found in other animals. That's a quote from de Waal. Hence, human morality has roots in our animal ancestry, which has been studied scientifically. And you talk about that in your third appendix. Can you elaborate on this a little bit? So, do you think indeed that science has something to say about ethics as well, or about morality?
Yeah, it's a very difficult topic, and
okay.
I don't have the last word on that. Definitely not. But you may know, that many people, many scientists think that science deals only with what is, and it cannot, in principle, deal with what ought to be. And I also believe that for a long time, but I have become more skeptical about that. And because, for example, if we agree that, as the Dalai Lama says, the goal of life is to become happy, I think science can tell us something about how to become happy to some extent, but I would emphasize to some extent. But and in that sense, I think science can make at least some partial contribution about what ought to be and not only what is. And so science can make some contribution to ethics, to moral behavior, morality. and so on. Yeah, that's my tentative view now. But it remains a difficult topic for me, and I don't. I remain open-minded about all this.
Very good. But what experience do you have that makes you think this way, or what made you doubt? Because you said, well, earlier you would agree with this, but now you're more doubtful.
Oh, earlier I just I knew the scientific literature and also philosophical literature that made that distinction, and I came across other literature only later on, like Sam Harris. He wrote a book about that, and so as a result of becoming familiar with other literature that emphasized the at least partial integration between science and morals. As a result of that, I changed my view.
Okay, wonderful. So what do you recommend that we read to delve into this, if we want to delve into this question?
I find the book by Sam Harris, I don't know, The Moral Landscape, I think it's called. That I found is a very good book in this respect, and I quote a few other ones in my. Okay. There is one by Kozlowski called an ecological ethics. So knowing about ecology and taking all that into consideration can have also an impact on our ethical and moral behavior, especially towards the environment and towards the planet. So these thinkers, I think, have had an influence on me, and I think they have a point.
Yeah. Well, that's a very actual theme, of course. At least among the young people that I deal with, I think realizing that what's happening to the earth also makes a moral appeal on people to preserve the earth in a way.
Yes.
I think it has a lot. I think this actually links a lot to what we talked about earlier, the mind-heart distinction, because not kind of flat integration, but some integration, because it seems to me that the philosophers that have made this objection, you say, well, science talks about not the is and not what ought to be. That's a very conceptual distinction. Trying to distinguish the objective knowledge of something and then the ought, which is then more subjective in a way. But if you take into account the kind of the first principles that we kind of feel, that if we're confronted with a particular situation that we know through our minds, but our hearts also feel that situation, and therefore it makes also an ethical appeal on us. So in that way, you can say, well, nothing ethical is being conceptually said. No, not true, but there is this appeal, and we feel it. So
yes, that's a good point, I think. Yes, I agree. Yeah.
All right, wonderful. Well, then we continue with one other last point that I have written down here, which I thought is a beautiful note to end on. But you may disagree. If you want to talk about other things, let me know. But it says, accepting an aesthetic based on love allows a different relationship to phenomenon than is found in contemporary Western science. That's a quote by Kirchhoff. And it says, it can lead to the re-enchantment of science, which is a quote by Griffin. So I would like to ask you, what would such a re-enchantment of science look like, and why do you think it would be important to have?
Well, it would bring in or integrate aesthetic experience of life. And although aesthetics in a sense is beyond science, although not everyone agrees that, whether it's actually totally beyond science. But at least it could lead to an exploration of aspects of nature that have not been dealt with if we exclude aesthetics. And it is known that many scientists have been sort of inspired and moved by aesthetic experiences, and this has been a starting point for a conceptual, logical, scientific exploration of the phenomenon, in which aesthetics may get lost, may disappear, but nonetheless, at least it was a starting point, and therefore I think it can be very important.
Wonderful. So, yeah, as an aesthetic aspect of science. Yeah, it makes me think a little bit. Yeah, this I don't know. It's a quote that I don't have very present, but it was something like, if you starting to do science may lead people away from God, but if they really dive in deeply and they start to kind of come back to to this deeper appreciation of the wonder of it all, basically. Yes. I think that's what you're referring to then.
Yes. Oh yeah. It's also interesting. There are scientists who actually think that if a theory is beautiful, like a theory that is simple and elegant, we can say it's beautiful in a sense. There are scientists, Einstein has made remarks like that, yeah. That if it's so beautiful, it cannot be false. So that aesthetics is actually a criterion for the validity of a theory. But I am very skeptical about this. But I can see why this can be very appealing. If you find something simple and elegant and which looks beautiful, I mean that this is of great appeal. That's a controversial topic, but an interesting topic also. I would think that in science, the ultimate criterion for acceptance or rejection of a theory is not aesthetics, but is simply facts, evidence. And so if you find counter evidence for a beautiful theory, I think you have to let it go. Besides that, aesthetics is also something personal in a way, right? So, but it's again also a controversial issue and an interesting issue. And I think I would not exclude aesthetics from science, but I think to me, evidence in science is still probably more fundamental in science. But outside science, aesthetics is extremely important, definitely beyond science.
Right. Thank you very much, Rolf, for this. These were all the content questions I have. Maybe I have one last question more about the process, because maybe could you tell us something about how long you've been working on this book? And how, what kind of conversations you've had so far about it, how it's going, and also maybe where people can find your Science and Beyond book.
Well, I've been working on it maybe only about a year, but much of what is in the book I've written about before, here and there, and I have 3 very long appendices in the book, one on my special field, plant morphology, one on health and sanity of body, speech and mind, and one on a very long one on the human condition. And these 3 appendices actually were taken from my website. They've been published on my website. I have a very extensive website. The address is beyondwilber.ca, And so much of it, also the chapter in the book, chapter on logic, is largely taken from my website. So for all these reasons, it didn't take me too long to write this book. And it's not, as you know, it's not a very big book, only 170 pages with a very, very long bibliography that I also had before already. So, so that's the history of the book. Where can it be bought? Well, it's available at Amazon and all major outlets, and it's also available as an ebook on Kindle and other ebook platforms. And so it's easily available. It has been, I've had quite a number of interesting interviews about the book. Especially, I had 4 interviews with Jeffrey Mishlove, who has an extensive site called New Thinking Aloud. There I had one interview about the book called Science, that he entitled Science and Sanity. So, and I've had other interviews. And I like talking about it because to me it's a very important topic, and because first of all, our science plays a very important role in our society. I would say even it's maybe the major force in our society. And therefore, I think it's important to understand at least the most basic principles of science and not be deluded into scientism that is so widespread, that claims that science eventually will lead us to the truth with a capital T. But as I pointed out in the book, it cannot, because the truth with a capital T is beyond language and mathematics and logic. And so we have to go beyond science. And this can lead to a much richer life and society. And for this reason, this is really at my heart, this topic, science and beyond. And for this reason, I was also very pleased when I discovered your blog, Science and Beyond, because I think we need more people to talk about this subject. This is a very important subject. And so I'm very grateful to you, Daniel, that we could have this interview and that we could talk about these topics, because I think they are really important for science and for our personal lives and for society.
Yeah, thank you. So if I understand correctly, you think that this book is not only important for people with a specific interest in science, but more generally for people who have an interest in just understanding what science means for our society. So you don't particularly need to be a scientist to appreciate, to the importance of what is being said here.
Oh no, definitely. I think it's a book that could be read by anyone who has some education and who wonders what's going on, not only in science, but in our society. And I think it's unfortunate that in our society, many influential people, including politicians and so on, have a very problematic, a very restricted view of science. And so this is imposed on citizens, which is unfortunate, I think.
Yeah. No, okay. I have to say that from my side, that after having read your book, I think it's written in a very accessible way. So certainly you don't need to be a scientist to be able to grasp the concepts there. And I think it really points out some great ideas that are worth reflecting on. I think some of them we've touched on in this conversation, but there are many more there. So warmly recommend it. Rolf, I really appreciate your time. I thank you for the conversation, and perhaps we can be in touch in future. It would be nice.
Yes, well, thank you, Daniel. Thank you very much. I really appreciate our conversation. It was a real pleasure. Real pleasure. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.